The silence in the room was heavy enough to crush a soul. 5 greedy people sat in leather armchairs, their eyes fixed on the lawyer, waiting to see how many millions they had inherited. In the corner, clutching a wet raincoat, stood the one person no one noticed. They thought she was weak. They thought she was stupid. They thought she was just the help. But when the lawyer, Mr. Sterling, finally looked up from the document and spoke her name, the went out of the room. It wasn't just a bequest. It was a bombshell. And when the dust settled, the Van family would never be the same again. The rain in Seattle on October 14 was relentless. It didn't just fall. It pounded against the black umbrellas of the mourners who stood around the grave of Arthur Van. He was an industrial criminal, a man who had built Van's logistics from a single truck into a global shipping empire. To the world, he was a genius. To his family, he was an ATM that had finally and conveniently been broken into. Serena Van stood at the very edge of the crowd. She wasn't standing under the large-heated canopy reserved for immediate family. She was standing in the mud, holding a small broken umbrella that was turning inside out with every gust of wind. She was looking at the back of her husband's head, Richard Van's. He was wearing a tailored Italian suit that cost more than Serena's father had earned in a year. Richard's arm wasn't around Serena. It was comfortingly around his mother, Victoria. Victoria Van, woman of ice and diamonds. Even at her husband's funeral, she looked less like a grieving widow and more like a queen awaiting her coronation. She turned her head slightly, her sharp eyes sweeping over the crowd until they fell on Serena. She grimaced a micro-expression of pure contempt before she turned back to the priest. Serena shivered. She wasn't just freezing because of the rain. She was freezing because of 5 years of marriage that had gradually eroded every layer of her self-esteem. Amen, the priest concluded. As the crowd began to disperse toward the waiting line of limousines, Serena stepped forward to join her husband. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched Richard's sleeve. "Richard," she whispered, "Kinda. My shoes are soaked." Richard spun around, his face twisted into a grimace that he quickly hid from the nearby photographers. He grabbed her by the elbow, his grip painful. "Don't embarrass me, Serena," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "The limo is full. Mother needs space, and my brother Marcus is coming with us. You're taking the staff limo." "But I'm your wife," Serena said, her voice barely audible in the rain. "Then act like it and stop making a scene," Richard snapped. He stroked his sleeve where she had touched him as if it were contagious. "And do your hair. You look like a drowned rat. That's disrespectful to my father's memory." He turned and walked away, climbing into the back row of the lead Mercedes. Serena watched the door slam shut. Through the tinted window, she saw him pull out his phone. He was smiling. He wasn't grieving. He was probably texting Jessica. Serena knew about Jessica. It was hard not to know when your husband smelled of strange perfume or when business trips to unpredictable places coincided perfectly with Jessica's Instagram posts. Serena had remained silent, not out of stupidity, but because of a promise she had made to Arthur Van on his deathbed. "Wait," Arthur had breathed, grabbing her hand with surprising strength just 3 days earlier. "Promise me you'll wait until the reading. Don't leave him yet. Promise me, child." So she waited. Serena walked over to the older gray sedan, parked behind the hearse. The driver, a kind older man named Thomas, who had driven Arthur for 20 years, opened the door for her. "I'm sorry, Miss Vans," Thomas said softly, his eyes full of sympathy. "You shouldn't be treated like this." Serena smiled sadly, wearily. "It's all right, Thomas. I'm used to it." "Mr. Arthur thought very highly of you, you know," Thomas said, as she slid into the back seat. "He saw everything, even when people thought he was asleep." Serena slid naked as tears finally welled up in her eyes. Arthur had been the only one who thanked her when she brought him tea, the only one who noticed when she wore a new dress, the only one who remembered her birthday. Richard and Victoria treated her like an unpaid housekeeper, someone who organized parties, cleaned up clutter, and was supposed to stay in the background. But Arthur had treated her like a daughter. Now he was gone, and she was alone in a shark tank. The reading of the will was scheduled for 3 days later at the offices of Sterling, Hall, and Associates. The building was a glass monolith in downtown Seattle that exuded wealth and power. The conference room was enormous, dominated by a mahogany table long enough to land a plane on. Victoria sat at the head of the table, tapping her manicured fingernails against the wood. To her right sat Richard, bored and impatient. To her left sat Marcus, Richard's younger brother, a man who had failed at 3 different startups, all funded with his dad's money, and who was currently finding himself in Las Vegas, though he had flown back specifically for the check. Serena sat in a chair against the wall away from the table. "Why is she here?" Victoria asked, speaking into the air without looking at Serena. "This is a private family affair." "The lawyer insisted all spouses be present, Mother," Richard said, checking his Rolex. "Just leave her there. You won't understand the legal jargon anyway, huh? Just don't say anything, Serena." "I want it," Serena said quietly. The door opened and Mr. Jeffrey Sterling entered. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for being relentless. He carried a thick leather briefcase. He didn't smile. He walked to the head of the table and forced Victoria to push her chair aside. He made his dominance clear at once. "Good morning," Mr. Sterling said. His voice was airy. He placed the briefcase on the table. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Arthur James Vance Owens." "Let's get started, Jeffrey," Marcus said, leaning forward. "I have a flight at 6. "Be patient, Marcus," Mr. Sterling said, his eyes cold behind his glasses. Arthur's instructions were very specific. He opened the folder. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. First, Sterling began, "Regarding liquid assets, to my sister Beatrice, whom I have not spoken to in 10 years, but who I know is watching via live stream, I leave the sum of $1,000 on the condition that she uses it to take a vow of silence." Marcus chuckled. Victoria rolled her eyes. Arthur and his jokes. "To my loyal staff, Sterlingford, Thomas, my driver, Martha, my cook, and Henderson, my gardener, I leave $500,000 each, tax-free." Richard slammed his hand on the table. $500,000 for the gardener. "That's absurd. We're going to contest this." "You're not going to contest anything," Sterling Shaft said. "The will is watertight, Richard." Arthur was in his right mind. "Interrupt. Don't touch me again." Richard leaned back, furious, his jaw set. Serena shoved him out of her corner. She knew what he was waiting for. The company, the shares, the billions. "To my wife, Victoria," Sterling read. Victoria straightened and smoothed her dress. "Do I leave the lakeside estate in Geneva, the jewelry currently in her possession, and a monthly allowance of $25,000. The room went silent. "What?" Victoria whispered, her face drained of color. "An allowance? $25,000. That barely covers my country club fees. Where's the capital? Where's the shares?" "The allowance is contingent on your not remarrying," Sterling added dryly. "If you remarry, the payment stops." "That's an insult," Victoria shrieked, jumping to her feet. "I was his wife for 40 years. And for 30 of them, you slept in a separate bedroom and spent his money on pool boys," Sterling said, without looking up from the paper. Arthur knew it, Victoria. He always knew it. Victoria sank back into her chair, gasping for breath. "To my son Marcus, who drove a Sterling Ford, I leave my collection of classic cars, estimated at about $4 million. However, they are held in a trust fund. You can't sell them. You can only drive them. If you try to sell them, They will be donated to charity charity. Marcus looked like he was going to throw up. He needed cash to pay off his gambling debts, not cars he couldn't liquidate. He can't do that. I need the money. And finally, Sterling said, turning his gaze to Richard. Richard grinned. That was it. The other two had been fobbed off, which meant that he, the eldest, the one who actually worked in the company, would get the empire, albeit half-heartedly. My eldest son, Richard Lars Sterling, I leave the family home in Seattle and my seat on the board, provided he can maintain a majority vote. Richard exhaled. A wide grin spread across his face. Finally, the house and the board seat. That's control. I knew the old man wouldn't let me down. However, Sterling said, raising a finger, quote, is the board seat useless without controlling the company's shares? Arthur owned 60% of Van's logistics. That 60% represented the controlling power over the entire empire. Yeah, give me the shares, Richard said, extending his hand. Mr. Sterling partially closed the folder and peered over the top of his glasses. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at Victoria. He looked past them. He looked into the corner of the room. Miss Vans, said Sterling. Richard frowned. I'm here. Oh, do you mean my mother? No, Sterling said firmly. I mean Mrs. Serena Vans. Serena, would you please join us at the table? Serena felt her heart hammering against her ribs, like a trapped bird. That was the moment. She stood up, her legs feeling like jelly, and she walked over to the empty chair across from Richard. Why are you calling her over? Richard scoffed. Did Dad leave her a tea set? A vacuum cleaner? Serena sat down. She didn't look at Richard. She looked directly at Mr. Sterling. Hello, Serena, Sterling said, his voice softening for the first time. Are you ready? Yes, Mr. Sterling, she replied. Her voice was firm, surprising even to her. Very good. Sterling cleared his throat and looked back at the document. The person who sat by my side during my chemotherapy while my family vacationed in Saint-Tropez. The person who learned the ins and outs of my business by reading my books to me when my eyesight failed. The only person in this family who has both a heart and a mind. Sterling paused. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I bequeath the controlling 60% stake in Advanced Logistics, all of the $300 million in offshore cash reserves, and final decision-making authority over the employment of all family members in the business to my daughter-in-law, Serena Van. And I mean, the gasp wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force. Victoria made a noise that sounded like a dying cat. Marcus dropped his phone. Richard simply froze. His brain couldn't process the words. It was as if the lawyer was speaking a foreign language. What? Richard whispered finally. That's that. A joke. That's a mistake. Read it again. It's not a mistake, Richard, Sterling said. Serena owns the company. She's your boss. She's the chairwoman. She's the CEO. She's a nobody, Richard shouted, pounding his fists on the table. His face turned a violent shade of purple. He's a high school dropout from the Midwest. She used to wait tables. She doesn't know anything about logistics. She's just Serena. Sure enough, Sterling said, pulling a second document from his file. You're wrong right there. Arthur has been secretly funding Serena's education. She's been earning a master's degree in business administration from Stanford Online for the past 4 years while she took care of the household. This also advised Arthur on every major acquisition in the past 18 months. The merger with Blue Water Shipping was Serena's idea. Richard looked at Serena, horror welling up in his eyes. He looked at the woman he'd humiliated, ignored, and betrayed. The woman he treated like furniture. Serena slowly raised her eyes and met his. The fear was gone, the shyness was gone. In its place was a cold, steely determination that looked frighteningly like Arthur Vance. "You," Richard stammered. "You tricked us." "I didn't trick anyone, Richard," Serena said. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight of authority that Richard had never heard before. "I was simply paying attention. Something you've never done." "That's fraud," Victoria screamed, finally finding her voice. She manipulated a dying man. "Undue influence. We're going to sue. We're going to destroy you in court, you little money-grubbing witch." "I expected this," Sterling interrupted, picking up the USB drive. Arthur recorded a video 2 days before his death. In it, he explicitly explains his mental state and his reasons for disinheriting you all. He explains other things as well. Sterling looked at Richard with an expression of pure contempt. "What other things?" Richard asked. Arthur hired a private investigator. He knows about Jessica. He knows about the apartment you bought her in Belltown with company money. That's embezzlement, Richard. A crime." Richard slumped back into his chair, devastated. Serena stood up. She placed her hands on the table and leaned forward. "We're done for today," Serena said. "Mr. Sterling, please prepare the transfer documents. Victoria, Richard, Marcus, I'll expect you in my office tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Don't be late. We have a lot of changes to discuss." She turned to leave. "Where are you going?" Richard cried desperately. "Serena, wait. We need to talk. Honey, please." Serena stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. "My name is Mrs. Van," she said. "I'm running a business." She walked out, leaving the three of them in the shambles of their expectations. The elevator arrived at the 40th floor of the Villages Tower the next morning was the longest of Richard Van's life. Normally, the security guards nodded obligingly, and the receptionist had his coffee ready. Today, the security guard demanded to see his badge. When Richard scanned it at the turnstile, the light flashed red. "Access denied." "There must be a mistake," Richard snapped, his face flushing as a line of employees formed behind him. "I'm Richard Vans. Open the gate." "I can do that, sir," the guard said, looking embarrassed but standing his ground. "Your credentials are suspended pending review by the chairwoman." "The chairwoman?" Richard spat. "You mean my wife? That's ridiculous. Let me up." Finally, Thomas, the family driver, emerged from the elevator area, but he wasn't wearing his usual chauffeur's hat. He was wearing a suit. He swiped a MasterCard, opened the gate, and motioned for Richard to follow him. "He's waiting for her in the big boardroom," Thomas said. "When do you give orders, Thomas?" Richard growled, adjusting his tie. "Ever since Mrs. W. appointed me head of corporate security this morning," Thomas replied calmly. "Turns out 30 years of chauffeurship sharpens your eye for who's loyal and who's stealing gas money." When Richard entered the boardroom, he found Victoria and Marcus already there. Victoria was pacing, looking exhausted. She hadn't slept. Marcus was slumped in a chair, staring at his phone, probably checking to see if his credit cards had been canceled yet. At the head of the table, Arthur's old seat, was Serena. She looked transformed. The oversized cardigans and messy bun were gone. She wore a tailored navy blazer. Her hair was sleek and loose, and she was reading a financial report on a tablet. To her right sat Mr. Sterling, the attorney, and to her left was a woman Richard didn't recognize, a sharp-eyed forensic accountant named Sarah Jenkins. "Please sit down," Serena said without looking up. "Serena, this phase has gone on long enough," Victoria began, trying to find her usual haughty tone. "We need to discuss the gratuity. $25,000 is simply not feasible for a woman of my standing. I have galas to attend." "I have a mortgage fraud problem, Victoria," Serena interrupted, finally looking up. She slid a file across the table. Arthur knew they had taken out loans on the summer house in the Hamptons. A house they didn't technically own because it belonged to the company. They forged his signature 3 times. Victoria froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish's. "That's 5 years in federal prison," Mr. Sterling added helpfully. "Unless the company decides not to press charges," says. Serena turned her gaze to Marcus. "And you use the company account to finance your gambling trips to Mao. $1,000 D-class client entertainment. Only the clients were blackjack dealers." Marcus sank deeper into his chair. "And Richard," Serena said, her voice dropping an octave. She turned to the forensic accountant. "Sarah, would you break it down?" Sarah Jenkins cleared her throat. "Mr. V has been funneling approximately $40,000 a month into a shell company called JC Corp Consulting. The sole registered representative of JC Corp is a Miss Jessica Miller. The funds have been used to finance a condo in Belltown, a Porsche Cayenne, and several luxury vacations." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at his mother. Victoria looked at him with pure venom in her eyes. "You idiot!" Victoria snapped at her son. "You got caught." "I didn't think she'd look," Richard defended himself. "She was just the housekeeper. She was supposed to be stupid." "That was your fatal mistake, Richard," Serena said quietly. "You mistook silence for stupidity. I've seen every bank statement that came into the house. I saw every receipt you left in your pockets when I did your laundry. So why did you stay? Why didn't you leave?" "Because Arthur asked me to protect his legacy," Serena said. "He knew you were going to run this company into the ground within 6 months. He wanted to make sure ownership was safely transferred to someone who wouldn't put 5,000 employees out of their jobs just so you could buy your mistress a Porsche." Serena stood up. The power in the room seemed to be shifting toward her. "It would be bad for the stock price if the entire founding family were indicted on the same day." She placed 3 documents on the table. "Barya, they will sign over the house in the Hamptons to the company to cover their debt. They will live off the endowment Arthur left them. If you complain, I'll turn the evidence of forgery over to the FBI." Victoria signed, her hand shaking so badly that she could not sell the paper. "Marcus, you are completely off the hook. You can keep the cars Arthur left, but you can't sell them. If you want money, you can apply for a job in the warehouse. Starting pay is $2 an hour." Marcus threw his pen across the room, signing the waiver, acknowledging his guilt. "And Richard," Serena said, looking at her husband, "you are fired as vice president." "You can't fire me," Richard whispered. "I'm a Vance." "You are fired," she repeated. "However, the company has a vacancy. We need a manager for the waste and disposal department in our Alaska office. The position pays $100,000 a year. It's cold, it stinks, and it's far from Jessica. Take the job, and I won't report the embezzlement to the authorities. If you refuse, the police will be waiting in the lobby." Richard stared at her. The humiliation was complete. "I'll take it," he managed to say. "Okay," Serena said. "Pack your bags. You're flying tonight." 2 weeks had passed. The media called it the Vans Revolution. Forbes magazine ran a cover story about Serena called The Quiet Strategies. The company's stock had risen 15% after she announced a new green energy initiative, something Richard had blocked for years. But silence never meant peace in the V family. It meant making plans. Richard hadn't gone to Alaska. Yes, he had gotten on the plane, but he had gotten off during the layover in Vancouver and returned. He was renting a cheap motel room on the outskirts of town from Seattle. He was desperate, angry, and driven by a narcissist's inability to accept DVM defeat. He sat in the dark motel room. The smell of stale cigarettes hung in the air. Across from him, sitting on the stained bedspread, was Jessica. She was not happy. Her Porsche had been repossessed by the corporate lawyers, and her condo was in foreclosure. You said you were going to be rich, Ethica snapped, aggressively filing her nails. Now, you're a fugitive from your own wife. This is not what I signed up for. Shut up and listen, Richard growled. I have a plan. Serena thinks she's untouchable because she's financially superior, but she has a weakness. What weakness? Jessica asked. She's practically a saint in the press right now. The grieving widow who saved the company. Her past, Richard said, a cruel smile forming. She grew up in a trailer park in Ohio. Her father was a nobody, but there was an incident before she met me. Richard pulled out a crumpled manila envelope that he had stolen from Arthur's personal safe years ago. One of the few things Arthur hadn't digitized. Arthur had run a background check on her when we first started dating, Richard explained, bizoned end. He found out that Serena had been arrested when she was 18 for stealing a loaf of bread and some medication. The charges were dropped because she was a minor, and it was her first offense, but the police report exists. To shoplifting, Jessica laughed. That's all, Richard? People love a poverty-to-success story. He's dull-bred to survive. It makes her look more like a hero, not a criminal. Not if we fake it, Richard's dad said. His eyes were gleaming with malice. I have a friend in digital forensics, a guy I used to party with. We can manipulate the digital record, change bread to cocaine, shoplifting to drug dealing. If we leak a police report claiming that the CEO of Vans Logistics was a drug dealer in her youth, the board will panic. The morality clause in the company's bylaws is strict. Any reference to past drug-related offenses will automatically result in a vote of no confidence. That's risky, Jessica said, now interested. If you get caught forging police documents, we won't get caught, Richard insisted. We'll leak it to a gossip blog first. Once the rumor spreads, the stock drops. The board gets scared. They're suspending you pending an investigation. And in the midst of this chaos, I'm calling for an urgent family vote to reinstate me as interim CEO. What do I get? Jessica asked. You'll be the CEO's wife, Richard promised. I'll divorce her as soon as she's out of the chair. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria wasn't idle. She'd have been forced to move into a smaller two-bedroom apartment downtown. It would have been luxurious for normal people, but to her, it was a prison cell. She sat at her small kitchen table, drinking cheap wine. Her phone vibrated. It was Marcus. Mom, I can't work at the warehouse, Marcus whined. My back hurts and the guys there laugh at me. Stop whining, Marcus, Victoria snapped. I'm working on a solution. Victoria had decided to take a different approach. If Richard was the hammer, she was the poison. She had arranged a lunch with Sil Thorne, CEO of Thorne Shipping, Van Logistics' biggest and most ruthless competitor. They met in a remote French restaurant. Silas was a shark in a suit, a man who had been trying to buy Arthur Van for decades. Victoria, Silas purred, pouring her wine. You look stressed? The downward spiral in lifestyle doesn't suit you. I want to see her destroyed, Silas, Victoria said, skipping the pleasantries. Serena, Silas chuckled. She's tough. She turned down my takeover offer yesterday. In my company's environmental standards were medieval. Is a novice, Victoria insisted. Listen, Arthur kept a black book, a list of bribes paid to customs officials at foreign ports in the 90s. That's how he built his empire. And where's this book? Silas asked, leaning forward. I know where Arthur hid it, Victoria lied. She didn't know for sure, but she had a hunch. I can get it for you, but in return, if you buy the company for pocket money, you'll give me 10% and a seat on your board. Bring me the book, Silas said, his eyes ice cold, and I'll make you a very rich woman. The wolves were circling. Richard was attacking Serena's reputation from below, and Victoria was attacking the very foundation of the company from above. The annual Logistics and Trade Charity Gala was the biggest event of the season. That was Serena's first major public appearance as CEO. He knew all eyes would be on her. She wore a stunning emerald green dress that made her look regal, a sharp contrast to the gray, invisible woman she had once been. Thomas, her head of security, walked close beside her. "We have uninvited guests, ma'am," Thomas muttered into his headset as they entered the ballroom. Serena glanced toward the entrance. Richard was there, in a tuxedo he had probably rented. Jessica was hanging on his arm in a dress that was far too flashy for a charity event. And in the corner, surrounded by reporters, stood Victoria. "Let her in," Serena said, her face impassive. "If you're going to make a scene, do it where the whole world can see it." The evening was proceeding smoothly, until the speeches began. Serena took the stage to thunderous applause. She began to speak about her vision for a sustainable future. Suddenly, the large projection screen behind her flickered. The Van Logistics logo disappeared. And in its place appeared a grainy, photoshopped police report. It showed a martial shot of a young Serena, one taken from her student ID and edited to look shabby. The text was enlarged. Charge, possession with intent to distribute cocaine. The room gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is that right?" Someone shouted. Serena turned and looked at the screen. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. Richard stepped out of the crowd, feigning shock. "Oh my God, Serena. Is that why you hid your past? You were a drug dealer." He turned to the board members at the front table. "Gentlemen, we can't possibly have a criminal at the helm of my father's company. This is against the bylaws. She must resign immediately." Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters yelled questions. Jessica grinned behind her hand. Serena tapped the microphone. Thump, thump. "Are you done now, Richard?" she asked. Her voice boomed through the speakers, silencing the room. "The proof is on screen!" Richard yelled. "You're a fraud!" "Thomas," Serena said calmly. "Please play the other video." Thomas nodded to the technician. The screen flickered again. The fake police report disappeared. A new video appeared. It was CCTV footage, timestamped 2 p.m. yesterday. It showed the inside of a seedy internet cafe. Inside, Richard Van and a man in a hooded jacket were hunched over a laptop. The audio was clear, probably recorded with a parabolic microphone or a listening device. Video voice. "Richard, make sure the martial shot looks bad. Put circles under her eyes. Change the charge to cocaine. The board must think she's a junkie." Video voice hacker. "That costs extra, man. Falsifying a police database entry is a crime." Video voice. "Richard, just do it. I need her ruined before the gala starts." The ballroom went dead silent. Richard's face turned ashen. He stumbled backwards, bumped into a waiter, and sent a tray full of champagne glasses crashing to the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Serena said firmly, "my husband seems to question his own, forgetting that Van Logistics owns the state's leading cybersecurity firm. We monitor threats against our executives. When Richard accessed the dark web to find a counterfeiter, our systems picked it up immediately." She looked down at Richard from the stage. "The actual police report," Serena continued, "involved stealing a loaf of bread and aspirin for my sick mother when I was 18, and we were homeless. I'm not ashamed of my struggle. It made me who I am. But you, Richard, you should be ashamed of yourself." "Arrest him!" someone shouted from the crowd. Officers who had been waiting for Thomas' signal backstage stepped forward. They handcuffed Richard in the middle of the ballroom. No, this is a trap!" Richard screamed as he was dragged out, Jessica tried to sneak away, but her path was blocked as well, aiding and abetting. Serena watched them go, then turned her gaze to the corner of the room where Victoria stood. Victoria was trembling, clutching her purse tightly. She had seen her son destroyed in seconds, but she still had her last card, Thorn. She looked toward the exit, ready to flee and meet Silas to tell him the location of the black book. But when Serena's eyes met hers, Victoria knew with a sinking feeling, she knows. Serena spoke into the microphone one last time. Excuse me, I have another family matter to attend to. But yeah. While Richard was being pushed into the police car outside the hotel fire, screaming about a supposed trap, Victoria Vans had already disappeared. She was speeding down Interstate 5 in her Mercedes, weaving through traffic with reckless desperation and terrifying the other drivers. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. The rain had started again. A torrential Seattle downpour that pounded against the windshield and reflected the chaos in her mind. They can't take me, she thought, her breath short and sharp. I am Victoria Van. I am royal. She fumbled for her phone. Her long acrylic nails clicked against the screen as she called Thorn. Did you get it? Siles answered on the first ring. He sounded calm, almost bored. He had probably already seen the news about the gala. He knew the Vans family was imploding, and like a true vulture, he wanted to grab the meat before the sharks got there. I'm going to the lake house, sir, Victoria shouted over the rain and the noise of the engine. Arthur hid the book there. I remember seeing him years ago, hiding it in the one safe behind the portrait in the study. It has everything, Silas. The dates, the amounts, the names of every customs officer he bribed in the 90s. It's the nuclear option. And what makes you think I still want it? Silas asked coldly. Your son is in handcuffs, Victoria. The stock is crashing. That's exactly why you want it, Victoria shrieked. This book proves that Arthur was a criminal. As soon as I release this to the press, the Justice Department will freeze all of the company's assets. Lorena will be forced to resign in disgrace. The stock will hit rock bottom, and you'll be able to buy a controlling stake for pocket change. There was a pause on the line. The silence stretched on for 5 agonizing seconds. And my payment? Silas finally asked. Millions of dollars in cash and a private flight to Zurich, Victoria demanded, her voice trembling. I can't stay here, Silas. Not after tonight. Get the book. I'll meet you on the runway at the lake house in an hour, Silas said. Don't disappoint me, Victoria. The line went dead. Victoria reached the lake house 40 minutes later. It was a sprawling wooden mansion, deep in the woods, smelling of pine and old money, normally a place of tranquility. But tonight in the storm, it seemed like an enchanted fortress. She left the car in the driveway, the door open in the rain, and ran to the porch. Using an emergency key, one she claimed she had lost years ago, she unlocked the door. Because the house was pitch black. She didn't turn on any lights. She didn't want to alert the caretaker. She cut through the dusty air with the flashlight on her cell phone. Her heels clicked loudly on the wooden floorboards, stopping like gunshots in the silence. She stormed into the study, a room that still smelled of Arthur's pipe tobacco. With a powerful push, she swung the heavy oil painting of Arthur's father away from the wall. There it was, the safe. She turned the dial. She knew the combination by heart. It was her own birthday, a sentimental weakness of Arthur's that she had always made fun of, but was now using to destroy his legacy. Ooh. Click. The heavy steel door swung open. Victoria reached inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She expected stacks of cash or a bag of diamonds, but there was only one object, a single black leather-bound notebook. Victoria snatched it up, clutching it to her chest like a life preserver. A manic laugh escaped her. "Got you," she whispered into the darkness. "I win." Suddenly, she heard the front door open. Footsteps approached, slowly, deliberate, heavy. He read it, she called and turned toward the hallway. "I'm in the study. I've got it. We have to go now." "It's not Siler's, Victoria." The voice was calm, familiar, and utterly terrifying. The chandelier above her flickered and flickered on, flooding the room with a harsh light. Victoria gasped and shielded her eyes. When her vision cleared, she froze. In Arthur's heavy leather chair, which had been turned so that it faced the safe directly, sat Serena. She was no longer wearing her formal dress. She wore a simple beige trench coat, her legs crossed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Behind her, blocking the only door, stood Thomas. He wasn't smiling. He stood there with his arms crossed, tall and immobile. "How?" Victoria stammered, taking a step back until she bumped into the desk. "How did you get here?" "I drove. I raced. I took the helicopter, Serena said simply. "It's a lot faster than a car, especially in this weather. And I knew exactly where you were going." "You can't stop me," Victoria hissed. Her shock turned to the aggression of an animal driven to angels. She waved the black book in the air. "I have the proof. This is the end of you, Serena. This book proves that Arthur was a criminal. Even if you kill me, Silas knows. The world will know." Serena didn't move. She didn't look scared. She looked pitying. "Open it, Victoria, Serena said quietly. "What? The book? You didn't even look at it, did you?" "Open it. Read the first entry." Victoria grimaced. Her hands were shaking violently. "You think I want? I'll read it to the whole world. I'll make sure you drag his name through the mud." She opened the heavy leather cover. She turned to the first page, expecting columns of numbers, offshore accounts, and illegal payments. Instead, she saw Arthur's handwriting, but it was not a ledger. "My dearest Victoria," the page began. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She read on, her eyes darting between the lines. "If you read this, then I am dead. And if you found this book, it means you tried to betray me one last time." "You were always looking for the shortcut, Victoria. You always believed that I built this company on corruption because you couldn't imagine success without fraud. You convinced yourself that I had a black book full of bribes. I never did. I built this empire through hard work, a concept you never understood." "No," Victoria whispered, turning the pages in desperation. "Where is it? Where are the numbers?" The next few pages were full of dates and entries, but there were no records of Arthur's crimes. June 14, 1998. Victoria forged my signature on a $50,000 check. I covered it up so she wouldn't go to jail. August 2, 2005. Victoria took a bribe from the construction company to renovate the new warehouse. I paid it back out of my own pocket. December 10, 2015. Victoria and Silthorne met secretly at the Pierre Hotel to talk insider information. My private investigator sent me the photos. Victoria dropped the book as if it were made of live coals. It landed on the floor with a heavy thud. "It's not a record of his crimes," Serena said as she stood up and slowly walked toward her mother-in-law. "It's a record of yours." Victoria backed away until her spine touched the cold wall. No, this is a trick. You planted it. Arthur knew for years that you were conspiring with Silas," Serena explained in a calm voice. "He knew that you were leaking Silas' trade secrets. That's why the company lost the Navy contract in 2018. Arthur kept every receipt, every surveillance photo, every bank transfer. He collected everything in this book and put it in the safe, knowing that the only reason you would ever open it would be to try to destroy the company Serena stopped a few feet away. You walked right into the trap, Victoria. Arthur gave you a choice. He gave you the will in his will. You could have lived quietly. You could have been a grandmother if Richard had ever grown up. But you chose the gear, and Arthur knew you would. The sirens outside were getting louder and louder through the storm. Blue and red lights flickered against the rain-streaked windows. I can make this right, Victoria gasped, looking around desperately for a way out. But there was none. Front door was flung open downstairs. Heavy boots thundered down the hall. It wasn't Syl Thorne. Victoria Van! Boomed a voice from the doorframe. Federal agents, hands where we can see them. 4 agents and FBI windbreakers stormed the room, guns drawn. Serena backed away and signaled for Thomas to escort her out. She didn't look at the agents. She only saw Victoria. "Ora, Serena!" Victoria screamed as the agents grabbed her, grabbing her wrists and pinning them behind her back. The click of the handcuffs marked the end of her reign. "Serena, help me! I'm your mother. I took you in. Serena!" Serena stopped in the doorway. She looked back at the woman who had mocked her poverty, who had treated her like a badge, who had tried to ruin her life out of pure malice. "You didn't take me in, Victoria," Serena said, her voice cold and final. "You tried to break me, and now you're just another item I'll cross off the books." Serena turned up the collar of her coat against the cold draft and stepped out into the rain, leaving the screaming woman and the past behind her. A year later, Seattle's insistent gray rain had finally abated, giving way to a crisp, bright autumn morning. Sunlight flooded the 40th floor of the Van's logistics tower, but the office looked nothing like Arthur Van's had left it. Serena had completely renovated the space. The heavy, oppressive, dark oak paneling was gone, replaced by floor-to-ceiling glass walls and modern, sustainable bamboo furniture. The air no longer smelled of stale cigar smoke and secrets. It smelled of fresh espresso and orchids. Serena sat behind the massive glass desk, a fountain pen in her hand. Across from her sat an exhausted-looking legal team that had once represented Thorne Shipping. "The terms are non-negotiable," Serena said. Her voice was calm but laser-sharp. "I acquire the fleet, the routes, and the warehouses. I retain 90% of the workforce. But the Thorne name will be removed from every ship's hull and every letterhead within 30 days. "Understood, Ms. Van. Mr. Thorne has agreed to all terms." Serena signed her signature with an elegant flourish beneath it. Serena Vans, CEO. It was the final victory. Silas Thorne, the man who had tried to destroy her with Victoria, was now living in a rented apartment, his legacy completely swallowed up by the woman he had called a rookie. "Thank you, gentlemen. Sarah will escort you out," Serena said, dismissing them. As the attorneys filed out, the room fell silent. Serena stood and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling city below. She took a deep breath, tired, but it was a good kind of tiredness, the kind that comes from building, not hiding. Miles away, in the dank, concrete reality of the Washington State Penitentiary, the morning was far less glamorous. Inmate 8940, formerly known as Richard Vans, was on cleaning duty. He was pushing a bucket across the linoleum floor of the cafeteria. His tailored Italian suits were a distant memory, replaced by a baggy orange jumpsuit that irritated his skin. On the wall, a small television played the morning financial news. And in a surprising move, Vans Logistics had announced record third-quarter profits, making Serena Vans its Businesswoman of the Year. Richard paused. The mob stopped. They stared at the screen. There she was, Serena. She looked radiant, powerful, untouchable. She smiled at the camera, a smile she had never shown him. "Hey, Vance," a security guard shouted, banging his baton on a table. "Stop daydreaming and clean up that puddle. You missed a spot." Richard gripped the mop so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked down at the puddle. It was oatmeal. He was cleaning up other people's dirt. "Yes, sir," Richard whispered, bowing his head. The irony was a bitter pill he had to swallow every single day. He treated his wife like a badge, and now he was the one cleaning up. Farther away, in a dank, cramped apartment complex in Boca Raton, Florida, Van stood at the express checkout counter of a discount supermarket. She wore large glasses to hide her face, even though no one here knew her. With trembling fingers, she dug through a stack of paper coupons. "Mom, this coupon expired 2 months ago," said the teenage cashier count. "I can't take this." "Do you even know who I am?" Victoria snapped, her old reflexes flaring. "I'm Victoria Vans. I demand to speak to your manager." "Lady, there's a line," a man shouted behind her. "Move or pay." Victoria froze. She glanced at the total on the screen. 50. She looked in her wallet. She only had $40 left. Her entire weekly government allowance. Deeply humiliated, she pulled a bottle of cheap wine from her cart and set it aside. "Take that out," she muttered. "Whatever," the cashier said. Victoria left the store. The plastic bags cut into her fingers. No driver picked her up. No limousine waiting. Just the hot, sticky Florida sun and a long walk back to a lonely apartment where the phone never rang. Back in Seattle, the elevator doors to the penthouse office opened. Thomas stepped out. He was no longer just the head of security. He was now the director of operations. Although he insisted on driving. "The car is ready, Serena," Thomas said warmly. He had stopped. At her request, they were partners now. "Thanks, Thomas," Serena said, turning away from the window. He passed the large mirror in the hallway and paused briefly. She remembered the woman who had stood in the rain at Arthur's funeral, soaked, shivering, intimidated by her own shadow. That woman was gone. In her place stood a titan. She stroked the lapel of her emerald green blazer. She didn't look at her phone to see if Richard had texted. He wasn't worried about what Victoria was planning. These were ghosts. "Let's go see Arthur," Serena said as she headed for the elevator. "I want to tell him we finally bought the competition." He's really going to laugh about this. As she walked through the lobby, the receptionist, the security team, and the junior analysts stopped in their tracks. They didn't bow in fear as they had with Richard. They stood tall and smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Van." "Great job on the merger, Mrs. Van." Serena smiled back. A genuine, warm smile. She walked out through the revolving doors. Thomas held the umbrella for her, not because she was helpless, but because she was the queen. The ignored wife was gone. The CEO had arrived, and the world would never ignore her again. What a roller coaster ride. Serena went from being the overlooked help in the background to the most powerful woman in the room, and she had brought down the greedy vultures who had underestimated her. It just goes to show that you should never judge someone by their silence. Sometimes people are just waiting for the right moment to speak. What would you have done if you had been Serena? Would you have forgiven Richard? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below.